Nathaniel Vaughan had always been the kind of man who made things happen. CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the United States, he prided himself on his ability to transform visions into tangible realities. Work consumed his life, from the early hours of the morning to the empty nights in the office. His luxurious, minimalist apartment reflected this priority. It was a space of efficiency, but without soul. Nathaniel's true soul was in the spreadsheets, the financial reports, the endless meetings. His wife, Isabella, no longer knew when her husband had begun to distance himself. In the beginning, there were still moments when she was the center of his world. Those casual dinners on Friday nights, the occasional trips, and even the shy laughter on Sunday mornings. But those moments became increasingly rare, like the sweet scent of a perfume dissipating in the air. Isabella was never one to accept emotional crumbs. She believed in a love that was shared, a life lived together, not side by side, but in complete connection. However, when time began to run out between them, when he no longer bothered to look at her as he once did, what remained were unspoken words, avoided touches, and silent dinners. As the months passed, Isabella found herself questioning her own existence within that relationship. She didn't want to be just the CEO's wife. She wanted to be desired, loved, felt. But at some point she realized that Nathaniel didn't even have time for himself, let alone for her. The frustration began to transform into something deeper, a feeling of emptiness she no longer knew how to fill. Until one day, at a corporate event where she was accompanying her husband, someone's gaze changed everything. Tomas, a colleague of Nathaniel's, a man who always seemed to be around the family, began to offer the kind of attention she had forgotten how to receive. Furtive glances, subtle compliments, and finally, a gesture of kindness. He seemed to be the antithesis of Nathaniel. Calm, attentive, always there when she needed someone to talk to, without haste, without an agenda. It was a genuine connection that Isabella no longer knew how to find in her husband. And so it was, in one of those seemingly innocent encounters, that she gave herself to him, not out of revenge, but out of a desperate need to be seen, to feel that she still had value. She didn't regret it immediately. The decision was made in a moment of vulnerability. But as the days passed, the feeling of loss she felt for Nathaniel began to dissipate. Nathaniel, for his part, was completely oblivious. He continued his routine, growing increasingly distant, without realizing that his world was crumbling. He still thought everything was under control, that his wife would always be his wife, that their love would withstand the pressures of time and career. But the truth was different. When he finally noticed that something had changed, that the warmth between him and Isabella had turned cold and distant, it was too late. Nathaniel's reaction was a mixture of confusion and regret, but he didn't know how to recover what was already lost. She, for her part, had already made her choice. What was happening now between her and Tomas was not just an escape from loneliness, but an affirmation of who she could still be outside of Nathaniel's shadow. And it was at that point, at that moment of total rupture, that their story truly began. Nathaniel Vaughan, in the eyes of the world, was a man who had it all: success, money, respect. The CEO of a tech giant that seemed to be an extension of his own personality, unbeatable and always ahead of the trends. His office, atop a glass skyscraper, had a breathtaking view of the city, but nothing he truly appreciated. For him, the city lights were merely reflections of the numbers in the financial report. He no longer knew what it was like to feel a true connection with the people around him. Work fulfilled him in a way no other human being could. Around him, there was a network of admirers and subordinates, but they all seemed to be just cogs in his perfectly geared machine. He woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning, without exception. His strong, unsweetened coffee was the only moment of pleasure in his morning, before he lost himself in the day's relentless schedule. Meetings, business trips, and corporate decisions consumed his energy, And when the day ended, exhaustion overwhelmed him, leading him to fall into bed without even realizing that his wife had already been asleep for hours. For him, success was the only measure of happiness. Isabella, on the other hand, had lost herself in her attempt to maintain the facade of the perfect marriage. When she married Nathaniel, she believed that love would be enough to keep everything in balance. But over time, she found herself reduced to the role of the ideal wife, living in the shadow of a man who no longer saw her as his partner, but as an accessory to his success. She had begun to feel the first signs of loneliness early in their marriage. That was when Nathaniel started to become more obsessed with work. Carefully planned vacations turned into just another job, with him always on his phone. Isabella spent her days between social events, keeping up appearances and meetings with friends who tried, unsuccessfully, to convince her that she deserved better. But the weight of loneliness began to become unbearable, and the vibrant, dreamy woman she had been before marriage gave way to an apathetic and disconnected version of herself. Tomas appeared in her life like a breath of fresh air. He was the kind of man who, unlike Nathaniel, made a point of listening. He made her laugh genuinely, not forcedly, and his attention seemed to be an antidote to the coldness of her life with Nathaniel. But what began as a seemingly innocent friendship soon transformed into something more. The complicity between her and Tomas grew, and the desire to feel alive, desired, and seen began to overflow. When Isabella finally gave herself to Tomas, it was more than a simple betrayal. It was a desperate attempt to fill the void left by the lack of emotional connection with the man to whom she had given her life. She knew her husband was absent, but she didn't imagine he would be so oblivious as to not notice her pain. Nathaniel, for his part, had no idea what was happening. For him, the world around him continued at the same pace. He didn't perceive his wife's distance, didn't understand her needs, didn't see the signs that the connection between them was broken. Isabella no longer sought him out. Their conversations had become increasingly superficial, full of small compromises, and her attempts to maintain a romance or a deeper conversation always seemed frustrated. Meanwhile, Tomas, with his simple and calm manner, offered her what was missing in her life: genuine attention and affection. He knew exactly how to make Isabella feel special, as if she were the center of his world. For her, it was an escape valve, but little by little she began to realize that her life was changing in ways she couldn't control. Isabella's social life also changed drastically. The emotional distance from Nathaniel caused her to open herself up more to new friendships and new interests. She began to frequent places and events where she wasn't just the CEO's wife, but someone with her own achievements, her own interests. She felt alive again, as if she were rediscovering parts of herself that had been left aside. But what Isabella didn't know was that this new path, this new freedom, would also bring her face to face with the inevitable, the impact of her choices on her life, and especially on her marriage. She was drifting away, but Nathaniel, later than expected, would begin to notice her absence in a way he never imagined. Nathaniel Vaughan had always believed that everything in his life followed a predictable course. He thought that by providing financial stability and a comfortable life, his marriage would naturally be secure. But in recent weeks, something had begun to bother him in an almost imperceptible way, and this discomfort grew stronger every day. It was a detail here, another there. The way Isabella smiled when she looked at her phone, the times she arrived home late or didn't mention where she was. Small changes that, for a man accustomed to controlling everything, began to seem like deep cracks. But Nathaniel didn't know how to react. He had never had to deal with the idea of losing something he considered guaranteed. At the office, he found himself distracted during meetings, something completely atypical. He worked on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't yet make sense. He didn't know exactly what was wrong, but there was an unsettling feeling, a restlessness that accompanied him even in the quiet early hours of the morning, when he finally arrived home and found Isabella already asleep. Isabella, for her part, was experiencing an increasingly difficult internal conflict to ignore. Her closeness to Tomas had intensified, but along with the new passion came a growing guilt. She didn't regret seeking affection, but now she was beginning to fear the consequences. Tomas was becoming more present than she had imagined. He sent constant messages, wanted to see her frequently, and was beginning to show an interest that went beyond discreet meetings. Tomas wanted more, and that was starting to weigh on her. She felt she was being pulled in two opposite directions. On one side, the emotional freedom she had discovered with Tomas. On the other, an entire life built alongside Nathaniel, even if that life was filled with absences. Isabella no longer knew who she was in this process, and as time passed, hiding everything seemed both easier and more risky. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was beginning to notice that his employees were commenting on Tomas's constant presence at the same events where Isabella appeared. An innocent comment during a corporate dinner made him freeze for a moment. "Your wife and Tomas seem quite close these days, don't they?" It was said jokingly, but the impact was profound. Something clicked inside him. For the first time in a long time, he truly observed Isabella and realized he no longer recognized her. This realization hit him harder one morning when he woke up to find the bed empty. Isabella wasn't in the room, nor in the kitchen. Just a simple note on the table: "I have appointments today, don't wait for me for dinner." It wasn't anything extraordinary, but that day, in that emotional state, that note seemed like a silent warning that something was breaking. Nathaniel tried to talk to her that night, but Isabella kept her distance. The answers were short, the conversations superficial. Each word carried an invisible weight. He tried to ask about her days, about her interests, but she always seemed distracted, almost as if she were somewhere else. The truth was that in many ways she really was. Tomas, noticing the emotional distance between Isabella and Nathaniel, began pressuring her to make a decision. He wanted to be more than the other. He wanted to assume a more important role in her life. This, however, only left her more confused and conflicted. The pressure was becoming suffocating. The tension continued to mount. Nathaniel's days at work began to crumble, as did his impeccable reputation. He arrived late to important meetings, missed deadlines, and his team began to quietly comment on his lack of focus. Something was clearly wrong, and however much he tried to hide it, his personal life was consuming his strength. Isabella noticed that Nathaniel was changing. He seemed more present, more attentive, as if he were trying to get closer to her again. But now, she didn't know if she wanted that closeness. Something in his gaze carried a mixture of guilt and distance. Nathaniel sensed this, and for the first time in his life felt fear, real fear, of losing something he had never valued in the right way. The conflict between them became evident during a dinner that rarely happened. They sat at the table, both silent, the warm lights illuminating the room with a soft glow that contrasted with the tension between them. Isabella seemed distant, staring at her plate as if she were elsewhere. Nathaniel watched her every move, trying to find any sign of connection. That's when he finally asked, his voice hesitant, almost breaking, "Are you happy?" Isabella took a while to answer. When she looked up, her eyes held neither anger nor sadness, but something even more painful, an emptiness almost impossible to reach. "I don't know," she replied, and Nathaniel realized at that moment that he was losing his wife. "But I still didn't know how much." "Now I need to know your opinion before continuing." As Nathaniel and Isabella's relationship deteriorates, subplots begin to emerge, reflecting not only the conflict between them, but also the increasing pressure they both face in other areas of their lives. Nathaniel, now fully aware that he had lost something essential, tries to compensate for his previous neglect with desperate gestures. He starts sending Isabella flowers, arranges romantic dinners, and even tries to surprise her with short trips. But these efforts seem empty to her. Isabella, already emotionally distant, begins to question what to do with these attempts. It's not that she doesn't appreciate the gestures, but she has already lost trust. Not in Nathaniel as a husband, but in what he represents in her life. A man who didn't know how to see her. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's work begins to visibly crumble. His competitors take advantage of his distraction and start diverting attention from his company, putting even more pressure on him. What once seemed like a mountain of success is now slowly collapsing, affecting him in ways he doesn't know how to control. In a crucial meeting with investors, Nathaniel fails miserably to manage the situation. He can't maintain the confidence he once possessed, and the reaction of his collaborators is clear. The man they always admired is lost. This raises an even bigger question in his mind. Does he have control over his life, or has he always lived in the shadow of an illusion of success? His once unbeatable identity begins to crumble. He doesn't know how to reconnect with Isabella and, at the same time, grapples with the imminent loss of his power in the corporate world. This leads him to make impulsive decisions at work, seeking to regain his confidence, but these actions only worsen the situation. Isabella, for her part, already feels the weight of her choices. Her relationship with Tomas has become more strained than she expected. Although the romance brought a sense of freedom and self-discovery, she realizes that, just as with Nathaniel, she can't fill the void with another person. Tomas begins to demand more from her. He wants a serious relationship, something deeper, but Isabella is torn. What began as an escape transforms into a new emotional prison, and she finds herself increasingly burdened by guilt. Isabella's main dilemma, besides the betrayal, is that she's afraid of being seen as someone who ran away from her problems, not someone who allowed herself to be vulnerable. She didn't want to be judged, and this further distances her from Tomas. What she was looking for, perhaps, was more of an escape valve than a new relationship. And while the two grapple with their inner turmoil, their families begin to realize something is wrong. Nathaniel's mother, a woman who has always stood by him throughout his career, starts questioning him about his personal life. She tries to offer him advice, but Nathaniel, so obsessed with his own dilemmas, ends up ignoring his family's concerns. He never realized how others viewed his wife, and now the pain of her potential loss is palpable even to those closest to him. Isabella's friendship with her sister Clara also strengthens. Clara, always present, tries to help her sister understand the situation, but Isabella finds herself increasingly distant from her own emotions. What she feared most, losing herself in a sea of wrong decisions, seems to be becoming a reality. Both characters now face their own flaws in perception. Nathaniel and Isabella are like pieces in a game, but they don't yet know how much the game is about to change. The pressure they both feel, whether at work, in their relationship, or from family expectations, begins to shape them in unexpected ways. At the same time, the relationships they maintain with the people around them, like Tomas and Clara, begin to weigh more and more heavily. The subplots previously discrete begin to become central issues in the narrative, reflecting the choices of both characters. Isabella, pressured by Tomas and her own feelings, makes a decision. She needs to get away to clear her mind. It's not a permanent separation, but a necessary one. She plans a solo trip, a break that she hopes will help her reconnect with herself. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, facing the collapse of his company and his wife's estrangement, feels the weight of his own failure. He realizes he's fighting a battle against time and his own mistakes, and begins to wonder if there's a way to salvage anything before it's too late. The turning point arrived silently, almost imperceptibly, but with such a great impact that no one could have predicted the consequences that would follow. It was a Friday morning when Isabella decided to put into practice the plan she had been hatching for weeks. She was going to travel alone. The decision wasn't simple nor easy, but she felt she needed this time to understand herself, to try to figure out what she really wanted from her life. Nathaniel knew about the trip, or at least he thought he did. He was so caught up in his own battles at work that he didn't even question the reason behind Isabella's desire to be away from him. She had never asked for something so personal, something so distant. As she prepared for the trip, something happened in Nathaniel's office that would change everything. During a crisis meeting, with investors pressing for immediate results, he received a call from his best friend and advisor, Adrian. Adrian's tone, usually calm and firm, was now heavy with urgency. "Nathaniel, I need you to come here right now. I know you're in a meeting, but it's urgent. I found something about Isabella." That sentence, spoken in a tone trembling with concern, made Nathaniel's blood run cold. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was unnecessary worry, but the expression on Adrian's face when he arrived at his friend's office was anything but trivial. Adrian didn't waste any time. He went straight to the point without beating around the bush. "I found a note. It's not just any note. It's a note from Tomas saying he's ready to go public with Isabella. Nathaniel, he knows everything." For a moment, Nathaniel's world stopped. The air in the room became thick and unbreathable. He couldn't process what he had just heard. Tomas? He knew everything? What kind of game was this? Nathaniel tried to gather his strength, but his body seemed paralyzed, as if being swallowed by a wave of contradictory emotions: anger, despair, helplessness. He quickly left the meeting without telling anyone and went home. With each step, the weight of reality became clearer. The idea that his wife, the woman he had neglected for years, was now in a game of deception with someone he considered a mere friend seemed unimaginable. The pain, however, was overshadowed by something darker: the feeling that he had been completely betrayed, not only by Isabella, but also by Tomas, who had somehow become more than just an intruder in his life. He was assuming the role he himself had abandoned. When he arrived home, he entered quietly. Isabella hadn't left yet. She was packing her things for the trip, but now everything seemed irrelevant. He watched her for a moment, standing in the doorway, trying to find words that would adequately convey the magnitude of what he had just discovered. But the words failed him. "Are you really going to do this, Isabella?" His voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper, but laden with something more, a mixture of anger and pain. Isabella stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, but unsure what to say. She looked at him, her eyes trying to hide, but there was no way. What stood before her was no longer just a disappointed husband, but a broken man, now facing the stark and unavoidable truth of his situation. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure, but her tone wavered. "I know about the note. I know about Tomas. I know you're going to distance yourself from me. I don't know how long you think you can fool me, but that ends now." The silence between them was deafening. Isabella looked at him, trying to find something familiar in the man before her, but what she saw was a stranger who now, more than ever, was demanding answers. The time she had spent trying to escape her pain, trying to find relief elsewhere, was now weighing on her, exacting the price of her choices. She approached him, her eyes brimming with tears, but no tears left. There was no more room for tears. There was only the inevitability of what was happening, the separation, the irreparable failure, the end of a cycle she knew had begun long before Tomas appeared. "I don't know what to do, Nathaniel. I just wanted to feel alive again. I couldn't stand this distance between us anymore," she said, her words coming out almost as a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear the weight of regret in her. Nathaniel, though torn apart inside, couldn't help but realize that in a way he had already lost. He had lost the right to maintain control over what was now happening. The separation between them was inevitable, and he knew it. But something inside him still wished, deep down, that he could repair his mistake, do something to bring her back. But it was too late. What happened in the living room that night rippled like a wave that shook the foundation of the life Nathaniel and Isabella had built together. The silence between them lasted for long minutes, until finally Nathaniel stood up and walked to the window, looking at the illuminated city below, but without really seeing anything. What had once given him comfort, the world view he had acquired, now seemed distant, almost unreal. He felt as if the world had collapsed around him all at once, and the worst part was knowing that he himself had contributed to it. He knew that Isabella's betrayal hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been a response to years of neglect, but his pride, his obsession with success, had never allowed him to see it before. He failed to realize that love, just like money or status, needed attention. He had surrendered to the illusion that his wife would stay by his side while he grew more distant each day. Isabella, on the other hand, found herself at a crossroads once more. Nathaniel's revelation made her feel a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief at finally not having to hide what was happening between her and Tomas, but guilt at knowing that the man she once loved, and still loved in some way, was now torn apart by the pain of his choices. But she no longer knew how to go back. Even if she wanted to, the words that had been spoken and the paths she had chosen were already set. Isabella looked at Nathaniel as he stood at the window. It was as if he were distancing himself from her once again, and that made her feel a pang in her chest. But at the same time, there was no more room for false promises. She had made the decision to distance herself, not only from Nathaniel, but also from herself. She was trying to find something that was truly hers, something that would make her feel that at least once she wasn't just following in someone else's footsteps. The weight of guilt was overwhelming. Isabella knew that somewhere deep in her mind she was searching for something that not even Tomas could offer. The certainty that her life had its own purpose, separate from all the expectations that society, her family, and even her husband had placed upon her. Nathaniel's love had been a constant, but he no longer saw her as a person, only as part of his own reflection in the corporate world. This had become all too clear. Nathaniel felt a blind rage, but also a profound sadness. He wanted to fight for her, but he knew the fight would have to be different now. It was too late to promise change, to apologize in search of forgiveness he perhaps didn't deserve. He hated himself for ignoring his wife for so long, but he didn't know how to act, now that the only thing left between them was ruin. He knew he couldn't simply continue, as if nothing had happened. Nathaniel's reaction was predictable. He withdrew into himself. During the days that followed, he avoided Isabella as much as possible. His anger transformed into a kind of emptiness, a disconnection that spread to every aspect of his life. At work, his cold and distant behavior made many see him as a broken man, lacking his former strength. And at home, his presence became a constant reminder of his life's failure. Isabella also distanced herself, but not before attempting one last conversation. She searched for him again, once more with a heavy heart, wanting to understand if there was still a chance to salvage anything. But the Nathaniel she found was distant, impenetrable. He looked at her without emotion, without anger, only exhaustion. "I don't know what else to say, Isabella." His voice was hoarse. "I know I made a mistake, and I know you did too. But that doesn't change the fact that it's all over." Isabella felt a sharp pain in her chest upon hearing those words. They weren't words of anger, but of bitter acceptance. Nathaniel was giving up, and she, on the contrary, felt an almost desperate need to fight, not for him, but for herself. She knew she had hit rock bottom, but she still didn't know how to get out of it. In the following days, she traveled in silence, emptiness spreading in her chest. She knew that separation was the only way to find herself, but at the same time, The distance between her and Nathaniel seemed impossible to overcome. They had lost themselves in their own stories, and now they were growing further apart, like two figures on a stage, each living their own personal tragedy. And while they both faced their own internal battles, Tomas began to distance himself as well. He had realized that Isabella was in an emotional whirlwind, and despite his desire to be with her, he knew something wasn't right. Perhaps she needed more than he could offer, and without a word, the relationship between them began to cool. Isabella felt, once again, the weight of loneliness. Tomas, Nathaniel, the reality of what she had lost and what could never be returned to haunt her. After the separation, the following weeks passed slowly for Isabella. At first, she surrendered to grief, a grief not only for the end of her marriage, but for the loss of who she thought she was. The woman she had been was now shattered into pieces, and the pieces were difficult to put back together. But amidst the chaos, something began to change. Isabella decided not to run away anymore, not from Nathaniel nor from Tomas, but from herself. She began to explore the city, allowing herself moments alone without the weight of the expectations of those around her. It was as if, for the first time, she was allowing herself to breathe deeply without the need to justify herself. She started therapy, something she had never considered before, and it became a vital tool for beginning to look inward, understand her choices, her fears, and above all, her weaknesses. Therapy was difficult at first. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she were bearing her soul into a space she had never allowed to be seen. But over time, she realized that what she called fragility was not something to be feared. It was the key to her freedom. Isabella began to question not only her relationship with Nathaniel and Tomas, but her own identity. Who was she when she wasn't conforming to the expectations of others? Who would she be without the weight of the roles of wife, lover, and daughter? She needed to discover this for herself. Nathaniel, for his part, was going through an equally profound crisis, albeit of a different nature. The fall in his career was merely the visible reflection of a life crumbling from within. When he lost control of the company, all that remained was a feeling of utter emptiness. The man who had always held the reins of his life now found himself adrift, unsure of where to turn. But in the midst of the collapse, he began to realize something. He had always had control over the outside world, but never control over himself. He sought help, as did Isabella, though more hesitantly. Facing the mirror of his own failure was painful, but slowly he came to understand how much he had neglected the things that truly mattered. He had traded his wife's affection for professional success, and now the two were distant, not only physically, but emotionally. When he realized this, Nathaniel felt lost. How could he rebuild a relationship that seemed irreparably destroyed? How could he regain the trust of someone he himself had destroyed with his own hands? It was during a business trip, months after the end of his marriage, that Nathaniel had a revelation. He was in a distant city, attending a business conference, but something there didn't seem right. He felt disconnected from everything, from his company, from the people around him, even from himself. Sitting in a cafe, observing the city's activity, he realized that financial success, absolute control over the corporate world, could never be a true source of satisfaction. He felt empty, without purpose, and something inside him, for the first time, was honest with himself. What he really wanted was not to be a powerful man, but to be a man capable of genuine love, without the obstacles of pride, without the distractions of the outside world. Back in his city, Nathaniel made a decision. He sought out Isabella, not with empty promises, not with his former arrogance, but with the sincerity of a man who had finally understood his flaws. He didn't know how she would feel, nor if she was willing to give him a chance, but he needed to try. Not to reclaim what he had lost, but at least to show her that he had become a different person. Isabella hesitated when she received the invitation to meet with him. The time they spent apart had been a relief, but also a source of anguish. She still felt the pain of the betrayal, but a vague hope lingered in her heart. She didn't know exactly what she expected from that meeting, but she felt she needed, at least, to hear what Nathaniel had to say. The meeting took place in a cafe, not far from where they had shared many moments together. The conversation, however, was different from all the others. Nathaniel wasn't there to blame or justify himself. He simply wanted to apologize, and that somehow touched Isabella in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't have all the answers anymore," Nathaniel said, his gaze sincere. "But I know I can't go on without at least trying to do things the right way. I made a mistake, Isabella. I made a deep mistake." Isabella didn't respond immediately, but inside she felt a wave of relief. It wasn't instant forgiveness, but rather the recognition that there was a possibility of healing, not just for them, but for herself. She had spent so much time waiting for someone to save her that she never realized that true salvation lay within herself. "I also made mistakes, Nathaniel," Isabella replied, her voice calm but firm. "I tried to run away from myself. And, in the end, I don't know if I can go back. But perhaps the true cure lies in accepting ourselves as we are, flawed and human, and that I don't know if we can do together." The conversation didn't resolve everything, but it was a start. The decision they made wasn't about getting back together immediately, but about understanding that perhaps their lives needed to follow different paths so that they could both truly heal and grow. Isabella knew her journey was a solo one, but the encounter with Nathaniel, although painful, helped her find more clarity about what she truly wanted for her life. And while they both embarked on a path of self-discovery, perhaps they would never be the same again. But at least they were in the process of rebuilding themselves. After their meeting at the cafe, Nathaniel and Isabella continued their separate lives, but with a deeper understanding of what loss and redemption truly meant. Both were trying to forge a new path, but something lingered in the air, something still unresolved. The tension between them, though lessened, was still present, and they both knew that at some point they would have to face the true test of their changes. Nathaniel, now trying to rebuild his company, faced challenges that seemed greater than he had imagined. Professional failure had affected him in unexpected ways. His focus was no longer just on work, but on how he could be a better man, a trustworthy man, worthy of forgiveness. Although his company was slowly recovering, feelings of inadequacy and insecurity still haunted him. He felt he needed an emotional fresh start more than financial success. Isabella, for her part, continued her journey of self-discovery. Although she still carried the weight of guilt for the betrayal, she had begun to free herself from the emotional chains that had previously imprisoned her. She dedicated herself to her work, to therapy, and was gradually relearning to trust herself. But something was still missing. She felt she couldn't move forward without making a definitive decision about what she wanted from her life and what remained of her marriage to Nathaniel. This emptiness, this lack of clarity, bothered her. The decisive moment was approaching when an unexpected event occurred. Nathaniel, still grappling with rebuilding the company and feelings of guilt, was surprised by an unforeseen situation, a crisis in the sector that brutally impacted his company's finances. Amidst all this turmoil, an emergency meeting was called, with all investors demanding quick answers. At the same time, Isabella received news that would change the course of things. Tomas, who had previously distanced himself to respect her emotional process, abruptly returned to her life. He sought her out, wanting to know if she was ready to commit to a permanent relationship. His return wasn't simple. Isabella was at a crossroads, unsure of what to do. She didn't know if she was ready to give herself to him again, but she felt drawn to the idea of moving forward with someone who, in some way, still loved her. Both characters, Nathaniel and Isabella, were at a critical point in their journeys. They had changed, but they hadn't yet made the final decisions about what to do with their lives and their relationships. What happened next was the breaking point, the moment when they would both be forced to decide whether to go their separate ways or try to resolve what remained between them. Nathaniel knew that the success or failure of his company depended on that meeting. But his greatest struggle was within himself. He felt that if he didn't take action regarding Isabella, the change he had sought within himself would be in vain. He needed to have the courage to face what remained between them, and perhaps it was time to take the final step. Not as a businessman, but as a man who had understood that his greatest failure had been not being able to love in the right way. Isabella, for her part, felt that the time had come. The pressure she felt to choose between Tomas and Nathaniel intensified each day. She knew that to move forward, she would need a clear answer, not a hasty choice, but a decision that reflected her inner growth. But there was still something in her heart that connected her to Nathaniel. Something that, even after all the betrayals and distances, could not be ignored. Their actions were poised to converge. Isabella, feeling she could no longer remain undecided, sought out Nathaniel. She knew this meeting would be decisive, not only for her and him, but for the future they could, or could not, build together. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, with the meeting looming and the pressure of his financial crisis, felt that if he didn't take decisive action, he could lose everything, the company, and possibly the chance for a fresh start with Isabella. The moment that was approaching was the true test of how much they had grown. Would they be able to surrender to each other without the illusions of the past, or would they continue to drift apart, unable to heal the wounds that had separated them? It was in their hands. Nathaniel's emergency meeting took place on a grey, cold morning, with the sky heavy with dense clouds. He knew this was his last chance to save the company, and with it, the image he had built of himself over the years. But as the investors sat before him, the pressure of all the financial weight seemed insignificant compared to what was truly consuming him. Inside his mind, the figure of Isabella lingered, like a shadow following him, a constant reminder that he needed to make a decision, more than simply giving an answer in business. He needed to finally choose who he wanted to be. As the meeting began, the tension was palpable. The investors were impatient, the company was in decline, and everyone's future seemed to depend on Nathaniel's words. But instead of focusing on the meeting's content, he felt a growing distance between himself and the corporate world. He knew that, at the end of the day, his business empire would be just a facade, worthless if he hadn't rebuilt what truly mattered: his relationship with Isabella, the chance to reconnect with the love he had neglected for so long. While he tried to articulate words that would make sense to his investors, his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Isabella's words, "I don't know if I can go back." The pain of that sentence still resonated within him. He knew he could no longer hide his vulnerability, nor continue convincing himself that money and success were everything. No, what truly mattered was having the chance to rebuild the lost love, or at least close this chapter in a way that would bring some kind of peace. And it was at that moment, while he was mechanically talking about the company's next steps, that he made the decision. He raised his voice with a clarity that no one expected. "I need a break," he said, abruptly ending the meeting. "I can't continue this right now." The room filled with murmurs and bewildered glances, but Nathaniel had already made up his mind. He stood up, picked up his phone, and left the room. He didn't look back. He needed answers, and the only person who could give him that was Isabella. Isabella was home alone, trying to process the past few weeks. She still felt the pressure of choosing between Tomas and Nathaniel, a decision that made her feel guilty and lost. Deep down, she knew it wasn't about them. It was about herself, about finding her own path. But when the phone rang, Nathaniel's number appeared on the screen, and something deep in her heart told her that this call wasn't just a formality. It was a call to something bigger. She hesitated for a moment, remembering the man she had loved, but who had failed her so many times. And yet, The call was answered. His voice, on the other end of the line, was laden with something more than simple need. "Isabella, we need to talk. Now." The urgency in his voice was palpable. He was no longer speaking like a businessman, but like a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. She looked out the window, the weight of the decision she was still trying to avoid, tightening her chest. But something about Nathaniel made her understand that perhaps what they really needed was one last chance to be together again. "Where are you?" she asked, already knowing that more than an answer, this was the question that would define their future. Nathaniel headed to the cafe where they had met months ago. The place was almost empty. The few people around seemed insignificant compared to what was about to happen. Isabella arrived shortly after, her expression heavy with conflicting emotions. She saw him sitting at the table, and for the first time in a long time, she saw not just the CEO of a large company, but the man who, despite everything, still meant something to her. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds, and it was Nathaniel who broke the silence. "I can't live with this anymore, Isabella. I can't live denying what happened between us anymore. I made a mistake, and I know it. But I don't know if I can live with the regret of not trying to do something right. I love you, and I know you love me too. I can't wait any longer." Isabella felt a lump tighten in her throat. That confession finally seemed to have broken down the barrier between them. She knew Nathaniel had changed, that he finally understood what he had lost. But at the same time, she also knew she couldn't go back. She was no longer the woman who had lost herself in him, and that made her feel a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Nathaniel, you're right. I love you. But more than that, I've learned to love myself, and maybe that's enough. I can't go back to what we were, but we can move forward, separately, with respect for everything we've been through." Isabella's words landed like a bombshell. Nathaniel didn't know what to expect, but the raw truth she offered him was, in a way, liberating. He realized in that moment that true love wasn't about forcing a return, but about accepting the reality of who they had become. They had changed, and the change they had experienced was what truly mattered. After their last conversation, Isabella and Nathaniel went their separate ways. What had been a relationship filled with expectations, failures, and betrayals unexpectedly transformed into a lesson in self-discovery for both of them. They didn't get back together, but the mutual respect they developed during their healing journey became the foundation of a new relationship, one no longer marked by the past, but by the understanding that love, in its purest form, can be as liberating as it is painful. Isabella, now stronger and more self-aware, found the peace she had so desperately sought. She was no longer bound by the expectations of being what others wanted her to be, and, in her independence, she flourished. At work, she became a respected woman, not because she was Nathaniel's wife, but because she was who she chose to be, a woman capable of growing from her wounds. She knew that true love didn't come from the need to fill a void, but from accepting who you were and being enough for yourself. Nathaniel, for his part, also found a new path. Although his company was slowly recovering, he felt that true growth lay within himself. Financial success, while important, was no longer his primary motivation. He began to focus on being a better person, not only in the corporate environment, but in his personal life. He knew that what he had lost could not be recovered, but what remained was the chance to create something new, based on regret and change. He understood that, although there was no going back to the past, there was always the possibility of moving forward in a healthier, more humane way. Both, in different ways, discovered that the ending wasn't about being happy or sad, but about being true to oneself. Love, loss, and regret were part of the journey, but what mattered in the end was how much they were willing to transform. Isabella continued her life, now freer, stronger, and more aware of her own worth. Nathaniel, over time, accepted that some wounds will never fully heal. but he also learned to live with them without letting them define his existence. And perhaps at that moment, they both knew that, although they couldn't go back, what they had lived and learned from each other would always be a part of who they had become. Years later, Isabella visited an art gallery in New York, where her own works were now on display. She smiled, not because she had achieved success, but because she knew she had found peace within herself. The art she now created was a representation of her journey, of her pain, but also of her overcoming it. Nathaniel ran into her at a corporate event. There was no longer any tension between them, only mutual respect. What had once been destruction now seemed like a solid foundation for what they had both built in their lives. Life went on, but they both knew that although love had departed, the transformation had given them something more valuable: freedom. And you, what would you do if you were in Isabella or Nathaniel's place? Have you ever experienced a loss that changed your life forever? Their story is a reminder that, although love can be painful, it is also the force that guides us toward change. Share your thoughts and tell us, how do you see their future? What do you believe each of them learned along this journey? Your story could also be the key to inspiring others. Don't forget to share it.